What's up, smart homers? My name's Aaron. In this video, I'm going to compare 10 different water leak sensors that work with Home Assistant. We all know that water damage can be very costly for homeowners and a real source of annoyance for those that rent their living space. Often water leaks start out small and go on for a long time undetected until they're noticed when significant damage has been done. Water leak sensors, sometimes called flood sensors, can be super useful for remotely detecting these leaks in suspect locations. They can be especially useful if you own a rental property, Airbnb, or vacation home that you aren't living in all the time. Water leak sensors basically work by having two or more conductive electrodes or probes that are exposed to water. Since most water, besides deionized and distilled water, is conductive, when it comes in contact with these electrodes, it closes the sensing circuit, letting the device know that water has been detected. Even a damp paper towel has enough water in it to close that loop. Anyway, I bought a bunch of different water leak sensors from a few different brands, and I'm going to compare their prices, their features, and I'm going to let you know which ones I would and wouldn't recommend. I'll also give you some ideas for how they can be used in your home. So as always, we got to go over the requirements for my sensor selection. They gotta work with Home Assistant, they can't work with any other hub than a Zigbee or Z-Wave radio, and they gotta cost less than $50. I didn't see any Wi-Fi devices that I wanted to take a look at except for the Shelly leak sensor, but that was gonna take too long to arrive to make it for this video. I'm going to be adding these devices to Home Assistant using ZHA and Z-Wave JS. Note that the no hub requirement assumes that you have Home Assistant set up already and that you have Zigbee and Z-Wave radios working with that instance. For each sensor, I tried putting them in a dish and then slowly adding water to determine which ones are most and least sensitive, but this testing didn't yield anything super informative, but I'll get to that later. Okay, so let's look at some Zigbee sensors. The first one is the Aqara water leak sensor. This one looks a bit different in style from some of the other Aqara devices we've looked at, like the Aqara button and the Aqara temperature and humidity sensor. Rather than the matte white body with gray accents, this one is all white with a glossy finish and has a single water droplet in the middle. On the back side, it has a battery compartment that can be opened with a flat head and two hex screws. The two screw heads are actually the electrodes that are used for sensing water. You can see that they're sunken into the flat surface at the bottom of the sensor by a few thousandths of an inch, and this makes it so that the sensor can sit on a flat metal surface without closing the circuit. It also means that it requires a very small amount of water to be surrounding the sensor high enough so that it touches those two screw heads. You can also unscrew these two screw heads and connect an external probe to them, allowing you to remotely sense water instead of having to use the device itself. If you take the battery cover off, you'll notice that it has a rubber seal under the cover, sealing off the inside of the device from water. I did find in the fine print of the manual that this device is supposed to be waterproof, so I put it to the test. I put the sensor in a bowl of water for 24 hours, and when I took the battery cover off, there was some water that had worked its way down a few thread lengths, but it hadn't even gotten to that O-ring seal. To pair this sensor with Home Assistant, you need to press the hidden button that's underneath the water droplet icon on the flexible shell on top of the sensor. If you press it and hold it for 10 seconds, the device will go into pairing mode and it's instantly picked up by ZHA. In Home Assistant, you get the water sensor, a device temperature sensor, and a battery sensor. Just a heads up, if you didn't see my last video on temperature sensors, Aqara often includes a device temperature, and that's not the same thing as an air temperature sensor. If you try to use it for air temperature, it will not give you accurate results. Since this device is waterproof, it might be useful in places where you're not just going to get a little leak, but you may get a lot of water. Some of the other sensors would be damaged if there's a lot of water, but this one should be okay. Just remember that it does float, so you might need to secure it if you expect a lot of water. The next one we're going to look at is the Linkind water leak sensor. Linkind makes a line of extremely cheap Zigbee devices, and this one is no exception. Once again, it's the cheapest of all the devices we're going to be looking at in this video. It's much larger and heavier than the Aqara, and that's mainly because it's powered by 3 AAA batteries. To replace these batteries, you'll need to unscrew the 4 screws found on the back of the sensor. On the front, you'll notice the Linkind brand in large gray letters as usual for their products. And while that has been negative for some of the other Linkind devices, a leak sensor is probably not out in the open very often, so this probably doesn't really matter. You can also see some holes on the front for the alarm speaker. This device has an 85 decibel alarm that's triggered when water leak is detected. On the back side, you'll see 4 electrodes, 2 on the top half and 2 on the bottom. When at least 1 from each half come in contact with water, it causes the alarm to go off. In the middle of the back, you'll also see a rubber button. If you hold that rubber button down, it's going to sound the alarm, so you can test to make sure the alarm's working. To pair the device with Home Assistant, triple press that rubber button. In Home Assistant, you get the water leak sensor and you get a battery level sensor. The next one is the Centralite water sensor. This device has a similar look to the rest of the devices in Centralite's line of Zigbee sensors, many of which have a set of holes on the face to allow ambient air to reach the temperature sensors inside them. This device has a series of indentations where the holes would typically be, but no actual holes. Despite the lack of holes, the device does have a temperature sensor inside it, and it has a hole in the side which would allow ambient air to get through. But honestly, that hole looks unintentional and worries me a little bit because if the water level got a little bit too high, it would definitely damage this sensor. The device has a gray back and a white cover with an icon of a water droplet falling into a pool of water. On the bottom, you can see the 2 electrodes that are positioned very close to each other compared to the previous 2 sensors. This means that even a very small bit of water, just a few drops, could trigger this device if it comes in contact with both metal electrodes. To initiate pairing mode, pull the battery isolator tab, and it's immediately recognized by Home Assistant, giving you water, temperature, and battery entities. One thing I noticed during my testing was that when I used a paper clip to bridge the gap between the 2 electrodes and simulate a leak, the entity stayed wet until I pulled out the battery and put it back in. Since then, it's functioned normally with no issues. Since the electrodes are nice and close together, this one's really good for putting up against the base of your toilet to sense a leak before it's all over your bathroom floor. The next one is the Aeotec water leak sensor, which I believe used to be branded as the SmartThings water leak sensor. For this video, I'm just going to refer to it as SmartThings since we're going to look at an Aeotec sensor later in the video. This sensor has 2 sets of electrodes. One set on the top in the indented area and one set on the bottom. The bottom of the sensor is gray with a rubberized texture to it with little standoffs in each corner. These feet keep the electrode from contacting the surface that the device is set on, meaning that you could set it on metal. You can slide the bottom of the device to open it up and you'll see the CR2 battery and also the contacts that connect the top side electrodes to the body of the sensor. This sensor is the only sensor of all the ones we're going to look at that has a true drip sensor. What I'm calling a drip sensor is the shallow indentation on the top of the device that has 2 electrodes in it. This is meant to be placed under a slow or potential leak in order to catch a small amount of liquid that drips onto the sensor. Even if not directly under the leak, the drips would eventually fill that indentation and trigger an alarm. To add this device to Home Assistant, you're going to put it in pairing mode by pulling the battery isolator tab. If you want to pair it in the future, triple press the button that's on the bottom of the sensor. In Home Assistant, you get water and battery sensors, but you also get a temperature sensor. I use this device to watch for leaks in some plumbing that are behind my toilet in the wall. Since it has a drip sensor, I can put it underneath a fitting I'm a little bit worried about, and if there are drips, it should land in the indentation and let me know before anything major happens. Next, we have the ThirdReality water leak sensor. This one has to be one of the most unique of all the sensors in this video because of its look. It has that distinct water droplet shape. Instead of going for the minimalist approach, they shot for a unique look that's all their own. This sensor has a raised plateau on top with little holes around the edge, and underneath that is a speaker that sends out a 120 decibel alarm when a leak is detected. This sensor is the loudest of all the sensors with alarms in this video. On the bottom, you can see 3 flathead screws that act as electrodes for sensing leaks. If any two of them come in contact with water or other conductive surface, the leak alarm is triggered. You'll notice that the screw holes for these screws are recessed quite a bit, meaning that the screw heads are raised up a bit from the flat bottom of the sensor. This means that more water would need to accumulate to trigger the leak alarm compared to the other ones that we've looked at so far in this video. If you'd like to make it a little more sensitive, you can add some spacers underneath those screws in order to make them closer to the surface or sticking out below the surface and make it more sensitive. Huge shout out to Caleb Pryor, who created a spacer that can be 3D printed and installed under each of these screws. I'll leave a link to his Thingiverse project if you want to go ahead and print one for yourself. The device I ordered came with a dripping detection kit, and what that is two metal pieces that can be attached to the device with the screws that are already there to extend the conductive surface of two of the electrodes so that they're really close together. This makes it so that it can sense a much smaller amount of liquid than it could before with those electrodes spaced out like they were. This isn't a true drip sensor like with the SmartThings sensor, but it does make the sensor a bit more sensitive. To put the device in the pairing mode, it's a bit of a pain, honestly. You gotta remove the 3 flathead screws using the provided screwdriver and install the batteries. Honestly, this part was probably the most annoying of using any of these sensors, was trying to get these flathead screws out of the device using the provided screwdriver. I ended up breaking out my Wowstick with a flathead tip, and then it was a breeze. Shout out to these sweet little battery powered drivers which make electronics jobs way easier. If you're interested in getting one, I'll leave a link in the description. The device also has a pairing button under the cover that can be used to pair the device in the future. In Home Assistant, you get the water sensor, battery sensor, and an on and off sensor that doesn't seem to have a function. If you have this device and know what this on-off sensor does, let me know. Okay, so the last Zigbee sensor we're going to look at is the Sinope Sedna water leak sensor. This is the first one we've looked at that has a probe rather than electrodes directly on the sensor. The body of the sensor houses 2 AAA batteries, which can be seen if you remove the cover, which is magnetically secured to the body. You'll also see a pairing button and some LEDs under the cover. The back of the device has a pre-installed adhesive pad for mounting the body of the sensor and also some slotted screw holes for a screw mount. On one side of the device, there's a 3.5mm jack, which is used to connect the sensor probe. The probe has a nice quality cable that's about 48 inches long, including the probe head, and the electrodes are set up in an interesting way. Both electrodes form an L shape so that the sensor can then be mounted either to a wall near a horizontal surface or to the horizontal surface itself. The probe head has screw holes for securing it to whatever surface you choose, and there are little rubber feet to keep it off the surface by just a bit. When a leak is detected, the audible alarm will sound. I'm not sure exactly how loud it is, but it's quite a bit quieter than the ThirdReality and Linkind sensors. This device also has a temperature sensor, which is not on the probe, but it's in the body of the device. The temperature accuracy is right in line with most of the accurate sensors that I looked at in my previous temperature sensor video. To add the device to Home Assistant, pull the battery tab and then press the link button under the cover. In Home Assistant, you get water, temperature, and battery entities. One thing I noticed about this sensor was that the probe has to sense water or the closed circuit for about 5 seconds before it sends an alarm, which is a lot longer than the other sensors, which were almost instantaneous. This really isn't a big deal for me, but it might be for you if you want instant feedback. This device is good for when you want to put a leak sensor that's in a location that's hard to reach. Also, if you need to sometimes remove the sensor and put it back, it's super easy to just disconnect the probe, do whatever you need to do, and then reconnect it. On top of that, you can change out the batteries without having to disturb the probe, super easy with that magnetic cover. Okay, that's it for the Zigbee sensors. Let's take a look at some Z-Wave devices. The first Z-Wave sensor is the Zooz Water Leak XS sensor, also called the ZSE42. This one is the smallest of all the devices we're going to look at in this video, and it's the first one that uses its electrode as feet. What I mean by this is that the sensor has 4 conductive metal pads, one on each corner, and these sit directly on the horizontal surface where you set it. This means that it'll be more sensitive than some of the others, although the difference is probably minuscule. However, if you set it on a metal surface, it's obviously going to trigger the sensor. If you open the cover, you're going to see a PCB that looks extremely similar to the Zooz temperature sensor and the Zooz contact sensor that we've looked at previously, all of which are part of their XS series. Pull the battery isolator tab and then triple press the button on the PCB to put it into inclusion mode. When I first included this device in Z-Wave.js, I did it in S2 security mode, and some of the entities didn't show up. I had to remove it and add it in non-security mode to get all the entities to show properly. This resulted in a water sensor, battery level sensor, and a low battery sensor. The configuration options allow for setting the alarm clear delay. One thing to note about the water detection with this sensor is that it doesn't just require continuity between any two electrodes, but specifically between the top two, bottom two, or diagonally, but not between the top and bottom on the same side. The manual has this diagram that helps explain that. The next Z-Wave sensor is the Ecolink flood freeze sensor. If you've seen my previous videos, you probably recognize this device because it looks awfully similar to Ecolink's contact sensor. In fact, it has almost the exact same body as the contact sensor, but instead of a magnet, it has a probe-style water leak sensor with a length of about 85 inches. This is the longest of all the probe lengths in this video. It has an LED on the body that flashes when it senses water and stays lit when the cover is removed. This is because it has a tamper sensor, so you can be alerted if someone's trying to bypass or disable it. It can be mounted with either the 3M adhesive or the screws, and a mounting plate is provided for the body of the sensor so that it can be clipped onto the plate once the plate is screw mounted. The plate is designed so that once it clicks into place, you got to take the cover off to get that plate removed. Adding this device to Home Assistant isn't too complicated. You just got to remove the battery isolator tab. In the future, you just pull the battery out for a second and put it back in to put it into inclusion or exclusion mode. When I first added this device to Home Assistant, there were only two entities showing, the water leak sensor and the battery level sensor. And when I tested the water leak sensor, once it turned wet, it never went to dry again. Also, there was no freeze sensor. Looking at the device information, I found 4 entities that were disabled. And going through them, I was able to find that 2 of them were the water leak and the freeze sensors, and they functioned properly when I tested them. I disabled the water leak sensor entity that was not working and used those 2. I confirmed the freeze sensor does work by sticking it in my chest freezer. The next one is the HomeSeer leak sensor. This one is my first HomeSeer device because the ones I looked at previously were over $50, but this one was cheaper, so I figured I'd give it a shot. This device is different from the rest in one major way. It has electrodes on the body of the sensor that would sit directly on a horizontal surface, but it also has a probe with a 45-inch length that can be attached to the underside of the sensor magnetically. When aligned properly, the electrodes make contact with the conductive pads on the magnet end of the probe, and the magnet end of the probe has a slotted hole on it that can allow the sensor body to be mounted to the wall when you're using it. While the underside of the sensor body does have 3 electrodes, only 2 of them actually sense water. The other one's really just a foot for supporting the device. The body of the sensor can be twisted to open the cover, revealing a PCB with an inclusion button and an ER14250 battery. The battery is wrapped in plastic, so you have to pull that off and reinstall it, and then press the pairing button to put it into inclusion mode. In Home Assistant, this thing comes packed with sensors, showing up with air temperature, freeze, heat, tamper, water, and water alarm sensors, as well as a battery level and low battery sensors. The water and water alarm sensors seem to do the same thing, so you could probably disable one of them. And I tested the freeze sensor in my chest freezer, and it works well. The temperature sensor is pretty accurate, within a degree of the most accurate of my sensors from my previous temperature sensor video. The configuration options have leak and temperature reporting intervals, enabling and disabling of the shock alarm, set points for high and low temperature sensors, and the low battery level threshold. Okay, the last device we're going to look at is the Aeotec Water Sensor 7 Pro. Like the Ecolink, this one only has an option for probe sensing, and also like the Ecolink, this one has the same housing as Aeotec's contact sensor. The probe has a cable length of 63 inches and the head has a hole in it that can be used to screw it into place. If you open the cover, you'll see an ER14250 battery. There's also a tamper switch inside as well as a temperature sensor. To pair the device, remove the battery isolator and then triple tap the tamper sensor switch to put it into inclusion mode. When I first added it to Home Assistant, I added it in S2 security mode and only the water leak and tamper sensors showed up. However, when I removed it and added it without security, temperature and humidity sensors appeared as well. Along with air temp, humidity, tamper, and water sensors, you also get battery level, low battery, and replace battery sensors. The configuration page has LED indicator options as well as options for temp and humidity report change triggers, automatic reporting intervals, temperature units, and more. Anyway, thanks for sticking around to the end. Now let's go over which ones are my favorites, and then we'll do which ones are my least favorites. Hands down, the cheapest non-probe style device is the Linkind water leak sensor. Having 4 conductive pads makes it fairly sensitive to water leaks, and having AAA batteries means that battery is going to last for a significant amount of time. However, I'm not a fan of having to unscrew a device to change the batteries, nor am I a fan of loud alarms, so Aqara is going to have to win in this category. Not only is it priced only just above the Linkind sensor, but it also looks aesthetically pretty pleasing, so it's not an eyesore. The screw electrodes that allow you to attach an external probe make it a lot more versatile than the other sensors and a good choice. If you want a non-probe style Z-Wave device, I would recommend the Zooz sensor. It's very small and discreet, and the fact that the 4 electrodes sit directly on the ground make it very sensitive to moisture. However, the price is higher than the other two, and that's because it's a Z-Wave device. My favorite sensor for catching drips has to be the SmartThings sensor. That little indentation with the electrodes in it makes it super cool for putting under a suspected leaky faucet or a suspected leaky fitting that may only drip every once in a while. None of the other sensors have this capability. If you want one with a loud alarm, the ThirdReality sensor is going to do it for you. It's annoyingly loud, but if you want one that you can definitely hear, this one's going to do the trick. Annoyingly, you're going to have to unscrew the screws to access the batteries to replace them, but since it's got AAAs, you shouldn't have to do it that often. One thing they could definitely improve on though is to replace those flathead screws with Phillips head. Also, alarms aren't always needed because if you're using Home Assistant, you may be able to announce a leak on your smart speaker and also send an alert or an alarm to your phone. My favorite probe style sensor, and the one that I think just looks and feels the best, is the Sinope Sedna water leak sensor. The entire thing has a high quality feel, and the magnetic cover makes the changing of batteries a breeze, even though you shouldn't have to very often because they're AAA. The audible alarm isn't too loud, so it's tolerable, and the extra temperature sensor is a great additional feature. The only thing I would change is giving the option for a longer cable length, because the length is shorter than the Ecolink, for example. This device is a little pricey, up near the $50 mark, and I think it even jumped over at one point. So if you don't want to spend that much money, but you want something that's a runner-up, I'd recommend the HomeSeer device. Alright, so here are my least favorites. I would not recommend these. The first one is the Centralite sensor, and that's kind of because it's just underwhelming. Beside the built-in temperature sensor, there isn't much else positive to say about it, and the hole in the side, very close to the bottom of the sensor, has me worried that it could be damaged by water before you get that leak stopped. Next, the Ecolink sensor. I love that it's got an extra long cable, but the fact that it doesn't even have a temperature sensor and only a free sensor means it doesn't have much else to offer. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video, and hope it gives you a good idea for what water leak sensor is right for your application. If you did enjoy it, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment if you've had different experiences than I've had with these sensors, or if there are other sensors that I've missed that you really think should have been included. Also, I'll be doing more reviews like this, as well as guides and Home Assistant how-tos, so if you're interested, consider subscribing and hit the bell to be notified when my next video comes out. And as always, thanks for watching. See ya.